So first, the definition. So our definition of net zero is to reduce company and value chain greenhouse gas emissions in line with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, and to balance any remaining emissions by enhancing carbon sinks, which remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Specific to commercial real estate, this means shifting to all electric heating, powered by renewable sources, and reducing usage in line with the asset's share of that forecasted renewable energy. In terms of net zero standards, net zero doesn't have a universal methodology across all sectors, as initiatives such as science-based targets do, with a governing body and assessment process. Organisations can interpret the net zero concept and indeed apply it as appropriate to their sector. Carbon Intelligence uses the UK Green Building Council's Advancing Net Zero framework as a foundation for our net zero roadmaps. The ANZ framework helps commercial real estate organisations avoid having to interpret what net zero is for them and provides a basis of aligning with best practice. It also creates standardisation across the sector, which improves collaboration, allows us to advance a common approach to energy efficiency in a whole life carbon for the sector. There are other notable methodologies, but specifically the CREM pathway is one that is also used within the real estate sector. And real estate clients are also signing up to initiatives such as the Better Building Partnership Climate Commitment and the World Green Building Council's Net Zero Carbon Buildings Commitment, which are both accelerating the move towards net zero carbon buildings. The transition to a net zero world in a deliberate and cost-efficient way will require a long-term strategy to reduce the risk of assets losing value because they are not future-proof. Net zero portfolios represent a transformation in how buildings are managed and are necessary to transition to the low carbon economy. For real estate, not adapting to the climate crisis will risk buildings becoming obsolete, losing value because they're unattractive to either let or to purchase. So as an industry, we have a collective opportunity to lead the drive to net zero and therefore a responsibility to do so. We'll have better buildings, which will be cheaper and easier to operate, more comfortable for our tenants as they return to offices, and responsive and easier to maintain. So in terms of when will it affect fund managers, so the UK government and EU have already made commitments that align with the 2015 Paris Agreement and aim towards net zero emissions by 2050, which provide clear signals that the direction of travel of economies across Europe are towards net zero. This has been emphasised by the recent target of a 78% reduction in all emissions in the UK by 2035, a clear step towards that journey. So within the commercial real estate sector, there's been significant shifts in recent years towards risk-averse and future-proof investment. So this has been driven by the increasing realisation of climate change as a global issue, likely to impact long-term environmental, social and economic stability. So with increasing legislation and investor pressure to manage climate risks, commercial real estate organisations will be required to address the carbon impacts within their portfolios. And the key question really is when and how. So by taking a proactive approach, investment in net zero buildings and refurbishment will reduce the risk of assets becoming unattractive to tenants and future buyers, and therefore risking a loss of valuation, which is the so-called Brown penalty. So in terms of how this will impact fund managers, so really the big challenge over the long term is embodied carbon. So major sources of emission within this commercial real estate sector are operational emissions associated with the energy use within the building, and also the embodied carbon of the materials that are used in the development, refurbishment, maintenance, and the end of life of buildings. As the electricity grid decarbonises, the impact of embodied carbon will become a larger and larger part of the whole life emissions of a building. The result is that embodied carbon will equate to approximately 75% of life cycle emissions of the building over a 60-year time horizon. Ultimately, it is our position that the market will correct for brown buildings. So for many years, sustainability professionals in commercial real estate have been looking for the green premium, which is the increase in valuation or rental income that can be attributed to green ratings and sustainability features such as BREEAM and LEED. However, the increasing market alignment around net zero shows that actually there's a far clearer negative correlation and rental income reduction from underperforming buildings. This so-called brown penalty will correct for buildings which require substantial upgrades in order to achieve net zero, as asset owners screen out buildings within their existing portfolio or acquisitions that do not align with these net zero pathways. In terms of offsets, to tackle offsets credibly, we must first understand what a genuine carbon removal is, as opposed to offsets that simply avoid carbon emissions. As the market for offsets grows and matures, the governance and transparency of offset projects will increase, and only verified projects that remove carbon from the atmosphere in a way that is additional and permanent will be deemed compatible with net zero. Offsets alone will not deliver the rapid and deep decarbonisation that's required to avoid the worst effects of climate change and limit warming to well below 2 degrees. Despite this, it's likely that offsets will still be required to neutralise the embodied carbon of materials, refurbishment, fit out and maintenance in the short term, whilst supply chain partners work to decarbonise. Finally, it is our opinion that deep green refurbishments will start to replace developments. So the embodied carbon of materials is the most challenging carbon in the property life cycle to neutralise. As operational carbon is reduced through energy efficiency, renewables, and the procurement of zero carbon electricity, the embodied carbon of the materials that make up our buildings will remain and can only be reduced through careful design and selection of materials. The lower carbon options will instead focus on deep green refurbishments to existing stock that do not incur additional embodied carbon and instead retain the existing concrete and steel structures and seek to enhance them and make them compatible with a net zero future.
Hello, my name is Abigail Dean and I'm Head of Strategic Insights for Nuveen Real Estate, and I'll be giving the industry view on net zero carbon. So at Nuveen Real Estate, we have set a goal to be net zero carbon by 2040. What that means is that all of the buildings that we invest in must be net zero carbon by that date. And the reason that we've set that goal is because we think this is a key part of our fiduciary duty to our clients and investors. We are moving towards a low carbon economy, and what that means is that all buildings will need to be net zero carbon by 2050 at the latest. And that is the view of the World Green Building Council that the majority of the real estate industry supports. What that means is that buildings that are not net zero carbon by that date will be obsolescent and will have lost their value. So therefore, it's critical that we have a clear pathway to transition our portfolio of buildings to be net zero carbon well in advance of that 2050 date. And that's as well why we've chosen to aim to get there by 2040. We feel that there is significant risk as we get closer to that 2050 date that buildings will start to lose value quite rapidly if they are not net zero carbon. And also we feel that there's some benefit to be had in the early stages of achieving net zero carbon a little bit ahead of market when there might be a green premium for buildings where supply might not quite be keeping up with the demand for net zero carbon. So that's why we've set our 2040 goal. We think that that gives us the best chance of enhancing and protecting value for investors into our real estate funds. The process that we have gone through in order to set out this pathway is we started off by selecting a few pilot portfolios in Europe. We did a combination of desk-based and site-based audits to establish what the key steps would be to take these buildings to net zero carbon, and also to get a better understanding of what the cost of that might look like. So the key actions that we established in doing that work were, first of all, the most critical thing is to reduce the energy demand in buildings, ensure that equipment isn't wasting energy, using energy when it doesn't need to. Then looking at energy efficiency, so upgrading heating, ventilation and cooling systems and lighting, for example. Then more deep retrofits, looking at fabric and glazing. Decarbonisation of heat, putting on-site renewable energy in place wherever possible, and then finally using off-site renewable energy to meet the remaining energy demands of that building. In following those steps, what that means is that all buildings become as energy efficient as they possibly can be, and then any remaining energy needs are met by renewables. And what this means is that a building can be completely operationally net zero carbon, and there shouldn't be any need for carbon offsets. We also need to look at the embodied carbon of any development and refurbishment activity, and this is where there will be some carbon left in the process. So when looking at embodied carbon, it's important, first of all, to reduce and remove any waste and make sure that the refurbishment or development process is as efficient as possible. Look at replacing materials that are very carbon intensive, such as carbon and steel, with lower carbon versions or with low carbon alternatives, such as timber. And then once you've got the process to be as low as possible in terms of its embodied carbon, to offset the remainder. But offsets really should be the final stage in the process, and the emphasis should be on reducing carbon as far as possible. So going through that exercise has enabled us to get a really clear picture of what the steps are to take a building, an existing building, towards being operationally net zero carbon, and to understand what the cost of that might be and how that will vary from for different types of real estate. The next stage is to think about, well, what is a realistic time frame over which we will do that? That will be impacted by a number of factors, such as the lease arrangements that we have at that building, the hold period for that building, and also where the local market is. So if there is local demand for net zero carbon buildings from other investors and from tenants. So those factors will give us a realistic timetable by which we feel it's necessary to move that building towards net zero carbon. And then the other thing to look at is, what is the impact on value going to be? If we're not able to make that building net zero carbon, what is the value depreciation that we might see? And if we are, then what is the value uplift that we might be able to see? So taking all of these factors together, the cost, the timing, and the potential impact on value, enables us to understand what the impact on return will be of the transition to net zero carbon. The key milestones for us in the next 5 to 10 years will be, first of all, to conduct that analysis across all of our portfolios, so to get a really good picture of what the impact on return will be for all of our different real estate portfolios, what the timings will be and what the costs will be. We also need to gather tenant data in a much more verifiable and consistent way, so that we can have a very accurate picture of the whole building carbon emissions. It's not just looking at the landlord element. To put in place our sustainable development framework globally, so that we're reducing embodied carbon across the board, to roll out off-site renewable energy, and then also to ensure that we're achieving our goals to improve the energy efficiency of our buildings. We set a target back in 2015 to reduce the energy intensity of our real estate portfolio by 30% by 2030. We've now brought that forward to 2025, and we'll be aiming to get to a 50% reduction by 2030. So those are the key steps that we'll be looking at in the coming years. Some of the key challenges for us will be that engagement with tenants. So gathering tenant data accurately and working alongside our tenants to do the work necessary to achieve net zero carbon. The skills gap in the industry is also a challenge. This is a new concept, and the industry is going through a process of upskilling and understanding what net zero carbon is, and we are reliant on our partners in the industry to help us get there. And then the other challenge that we see is the fact that at the moment there is no certification which enables us to say definitively whether a building is net zero carbon or not. There are some very useful frameworks out there, as you heard from Chris, but we really do need to have a certification so that we can credibly state whether our buildings are net zero carbon or not. So we're very excited to have set our net zero carbon by 2040 goal, and we look forward to working with our peers and partners in the industry to move real estate to a low carbon future. Thank you.